Games are one of the most common ways, people all over the world spend their leisure time, whether it's a board game after dinner or an online role-playing experience through an alternate world. Jacob Geller spends a lot of time thinking about games, how they're designed, the storylines, the art, and much, much more. Jacob Geller is a video essayist and author of How a Game Lives. Jacob, welcome to Climate One.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So you play video games sort of for a living and write about them and analyze them. Do you have an idea of, roughly maybe how many hours a week or a year you spend playing?
Oh, that's it's an impossible question. When you make your hobby your passion and your career at the same time, you just kind of lose track of all hours. But I last year I rolled credits on about 60 video games, which is a significant time commitment because you can watch a movie in 2 hours, but some games take 50, 100 hours to beat.
Wow, so rolled credits means you played the whole game all the way through.
Yes, and some of those games are an hour long, but then some of them took months.
Days, yeah, months, yeah, yeah. Okay. So it's hard to make blanket statements about video games because it's a huge and diverse field, tons of creators, tons of companies, so on. But many games use a version of a climate crisis, where humans have essentially destroyed the world as we know it, as a starting point for the story and the characters. Why do you think this is a common trope?
I think games love to put you in challenging situations in which you need to use, a number of skills to survive. Recently, I mean, throughout gaming, but especially recently, the idea of kind of scavenging, collecting maybe like, rusted or decrepit parts and building back something great is very popular in games. And all of these things work really well into dystopic settings, and a kind of post climate crisis world provides a really good one of those, especially because games often frame those worlds as very beautiful, of kind of
Mm.
like, the rivers are running through the streets of our cities and trees have overgrown our skyscrapers, almost a humans have died out and nature has retaken over kind of world.
Yeah, I can see that there's some appeal there, though it's kind of a scary concept, but also, yeah, this idea of nature reemerging. Let's talk for just a second about a specific game. So there's one called Frostpunk. This is a society survival game, as you're describing. People have to make decisions in the last city on Earth to survive an apocalyptic winter. So I don't want to stretch too far, but you've played this game. Are there climate lessons, climate ideas embedded within a game like that?
Absolutely. I mean, it is the context in which the entire game takes place. And Frostpunk is kind of a game built on difficult decisions, where you are already at such an extreme state where there is this incredibly powerful ice age that is kind of encroaching on your city that you are constantly having to choose. Do you mine more fuel for your generator, even if that means people are working 18-hour shifts? Do you allow child labor? Do you stretch food rationing even further? And so it's all of these kind of nightmare questions, where there are no good answers, but the game forces you to pick one because it's saying this is how extreme the situation is. This is what you're going to have to do if you want to survive this kind of crisis.
That's kind of dark.
It's it's an incredibly dark game. I think it goes into the category of game where I would say it's very interesting and it's compelling. I don't really enjoy playing it. It's
Okay.
not something that I play to relax.
Yeah, and do you think there's a message that's kind of a takeaway from the designers, or is it more just to create this experience as as a game?
I mean, I think that it is, if I don't want to speak for the designers, maybe they just wanted a fun context to make kind of a survival game. But for me, it is a kind of eminently more imaginable apocalypse than, say,
Mm.
aliens descended or the Terminator robots took over. This feels almost foreseeable,
Mhm.
and so when I'm playing the game, I am thinking, oh, my goodness, I hope we do everything we can to stop us from ever reaching the point where we have to decide on this kind of food rationing or child labor or whatever it is.
Yeah, let's keep it in the futuristic non-reality. So As you touched on, a lot of games involve elements of a kind of climate altered present or future, not just the setting, but even just the gameplay. So resource scarcity, conflict, survival, rationing, are those from a game design standpoint necessary because they introduce conflict and you need that for the drama? I mean, are there like why do you think those are common elements that we see in a lot of games?
I do think that, creating tension is always kind of leads to interesting game mechanics. If supplies were everywhere and easy to find, then a player might not be motivated to go into more dangerous areas because they needed something specific. Recently, even, recent Battlefield games, which I don't think of as a very thoughtful franchise, have incorporated ideas of climate disaster into them because it's more interesting to have a giant multiplayer shooting match if an enormous weather event breaks out in the middle of it. There are ways in that introducing these kind of disasters can just create more interesting scenarios. But the question that I'm always thinking about with these is, are they just using them as fun context? Is it just kind of a way of setting up what if a tornado went through the middle of our multiplayer map? Or is there a more thoughtful reason that the game is putting itself in this specific situation?
Right, and that probably just depends to some extent on the game and the designers and so forth. So we've talked a bit about some of the more dystopian frames and elements. There's also a lot of games that are kind of classified as world building, where players create new cities or civilizations from scratch. To me, these seem more optimistic because the frame is somewhat more positive and players have a lot of agency. I mean, they can have agency in lots of games, but they can kind of create a world that they want. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think so. I mean, there are, for decades in games, there have been these ideas of city building games. Sim City is kind of the progenitor of these, and they've continued. And many players, I think, find it rewarding among themselves to create their version of a utopian city, and that often includes the city runs on renewable energy, or we have lots of, accessible public transport or something. There's also kind of an interesting side effect that these games can have, which is that sometimes in pressuring players to make an effective city, they can kind of present the ideas or like the problems of modern civilization in just kind of a naturally occurring way. Or if a player wants to build a modern city, they build the city center and they build suburbs, and then they realize just how much road infrastructure has to be built to connect the suburbs to the cities, and they realize just how much of their city has to be taken up with parking lots because those cars all need to go somewhere. And so it's actually not an uncommon experience for players to be gently radicalized against cars just in the process of trying to make an effective and efficient city.
I like that. That's really interesting. I was going to bring up another game in this world of games, one called Cities Skyline. It's very much what you're describing of a game people can use to build a city. And I haven't played this game, but from what I understand, you can do things like implement congestion pricing or offer free public transportation and then see how that plays out as you're saying, how it affects maybe how many people drive cars and where you need to build things. So that to me that's really fascinating.
Yeah, when you're making one of these city designing games, the question is always, for a designer, where do you reduce the complexity? Because it would not be fun to give, to make a player do every element of bureaucracy that goes into making a city. But in putting back in some of these, what we think of as nitty gritty legislative controls of congestion pricing and whatnot, the game is actually centering those questions of what it means to be an environmentally conscious city or a public transportation focused city. They're making the player think about that in the same way that if the game implemented tons of mechanics based around waste management, suddenly all the players would be thinking about how their own city dealt with waste management. It's just a question of kind of what do the designers choose to prioritize when they're giving players controls.
Hmm. So broadly speaking, who is making games that have a core focus on climate change? And are these games generally for a popular or more niche indie audience?
All sorts of teams of all sorts of sizes are making games that use climate change in some way. I will say that the more pointed games, the ones that are more kind of specifically have a perspective and can maybe be a little more explicit with their politics, tend to be made by small independent teams. Some games, the biggest games, have teams of hundreds or thousands of people working on them. Independent games often have a handful, 5, 10, or even sometimes like one person. And those experiences, I think, can be much more personal and much more specific about how they're interacting with the changing climate.
Yeah, when we spoke before, you mentioned one I'd like to talk about, Umurangi Generation, which you told me translates to Red Sky Generation, and this is made by a New Zealand developer after pretty dramatic, kind of apocalyptic wildfires in Australia. Can you talk a little bit about where the game originated and what the designer's intent was in offering this game?
Yeah, so Umurangi Generation is it was made in response to the late 19 or 2019, early 2020 bushfires in Australia. The developer is Maori and is specifically dealing with questions of what it means to be indigenous and colonized in the context of this giant changing climate. And the game starts out, and it seems that you're just kind of playing as youth who are kind of chilling out while the world ends. The first several levels are you playing as just kind of punk teens. It's actually a photography game, and so your main mechanic is taking pictures of things. And you're just taking pictures of your friends and different things on the skyline and whatnot. And as the game goes on, it becomes more clear that the game is not just about wildfires, which the game the game kind of uses this allegory of a kaiju. So it's almost like there's Godzilla, but Godzilla in this case is a metaphor for climate change. The real villain of the game is not the kaiju, though. It is the kind of institutions and industry that have allowed it to get there. You realize that the naturally occurring things are maybe unpredictable, or they're uncontrollable, they're hard to stop, but they've been allowed to happen this much because of the kind of neglect of companies and institutions that are supposed to be overseeing this. And so where the game ultimately ends up is not a confrontation with the climate disaster specifically, but a confrontation with police and government who are cracking down on climate protesters. It becomes very pointed at the idea of like who is perpetuating the climate crisis and who is profiting from the climate crisis, and what does it mean to protest these things.
Wow, that's really interesting. So, how popular are games like that? I mean, in terms of the number of people playing them, do these kind of climate or green games stack up to the more popular ones?
It's difficult to put a specific number on it, but I do think that the widely popular kind of like more geared to a general audience games are less specific about the climate crisis, and games like Umurangi Generation, which are really pointed and really explicit in its politics, attract a more niche audience. For me, I played that game because I was attracted to the idea of this kind of political message, but I am someone who really keeps on top of interesting developments in the indie scene, and I think most people probably haven't heard about it at all. It's harder to make a pitch on it's a photography game that's dealing with industry's failure to contain a climate crisis than what if you were a cool character running around abandoned buildings. It's a much easier video game to pitch.
Totally, yeah. Do you think there's hesitation among game developers to include elements like, an environmental, a climate, a anti-capitalist message that might be seen as really having a political point of view?
Yes, it's a kind of ongoing debate in the video game field about what games are or are not political, and especially when a game is developed by a bigger company that I think wants to remain uncontroversial, that doesn't want to be seen as taking a position or not, you will get these very strange and contradictory answers where they'll make their game centering around some sort of obvious political or climate crisis, but then the public statements will say, we're not actually saying anything with this. We don't mean to provide commentary. This is just a setting for our game. And I think those kind of answers come because they're scared to make any sort of heavy public statement saying, yes, we believe in something and this is our position. When you get down to those more independent developers, they are less afraid to make those sort of statements, in effect because they're speaking for less people, and so they can just represent their own views rather than the views of a 1,000-person company.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When we spoke before, you mentioned that Final Fantasy VII, which is a hugely popular role-playing game, essentially has characters who are eco-terrorists, and that's not necessarily the core message of the game or the reason you play, but it's there, it's part of the narrative. How much do you think a game's storyline matters to the people playing it?
I think a game's storyline is hugely important. It depends on the genre of game. Something that I mentioned, like Battlefield, is mostly a game where you shoot people and the story is kind of tertiary. Final Fantasy is a role playing game completely centered on its characters and motivations and setting. And so in this situation, it is something that you are confronting constantly. The setup in Final Fantasy VII is that there is a resource called Mako, which is described as literally the planet's life force. And the first mission in the game is you are going into an enormous facility that is siphoning that life force to drive the industry of a city. And you blow it up. And your characters speak very specifically about how sucking the planet's life force is a bad thing to do. The game eventually branches out into many more storylines, but there is this idea of like, the planet is sacred, the resources that come from the planet are sacred, and using them so thoughtlessly is a negative thing, and that theme persists throughout the entire game.
Hmm. Well, we've seen a lot more presence of climate themes, climate challenges, extreme weather, some of this kind of public consciousness in other forms of media, right? So lots more appearance of that in movies, in television shows. I can even think of shows that, I mean, that shows that have nothing to do on their surface with these issues. I was watching Slow Horses, and there's like a scene where an eco-terrorist sort of tries to convey a message by putting like a chemical in the gas supply. So all these cars start on fire as a way to say like we shouldn't be dependent, but the storyline isn't even about that. That's just like part of the plot. So, video games are a form of media like any other and a form of expression. So they're seeing these influences. And I'm wondering if you think we'll see more appearance of climate themes, environmental messages in the coming years as the climate crisis increasingly kind of intensifies for people.
I do. Like any other media, I think the reason that we are seeing ideas of the climate crisis pop up in so many different medias at the same time isn't some, concerted effort or even kind of artists hoping that they can change minds, but simply people making art in the context that they're living. It gets harder and harder to live any day without thinking of what is happening to the climate, what is happening to the world around us, and that inevitably affects the art you make. Games are the combination of work from every different artistic medium put together, and I've met many of those people, and they're living in the same world as I am, which means that they are thinking about these things that are happening to them and they're putting them into the game. So whether or not the game is saying it's explicitly about the climate, I think we are seeing more games already that are just about this idea of what it means to undergo a massive, planetary change, whether that's something like Death Stranding or Clair Obscur Expedition 33. All of these games are about these ideas of kind of death and apocalypse and what it means to move on from that.
As we wrap up here, I'm wondering if you have recommendations of games that you think encapsulate some of this, whether it's a game that's enjoyable for playing, regardless of the message, or a game, as you said, that makes you kind of think about these things, confront some of these questions. Are there any that you'd recommend to players?
I would certainly recommend Umurangi Generation, which we talked about previously. I would also recommend there's a developer named Kara Stone who's made a couple games that are very both climate focused and climate conscious in how they're made. She's made a game called Unearth You, which is in theory a game about having kind of a digital AI therapist, but becomes a game about kind of the toll that having an AI therapist might wreak on the world around it. And another game called Known Mysteries, which is about living in kind of a company town that's being polluted. And Known Mysteries is fascinating because it actually runs on a solar powered server that she has in, I believe, her backyard,
Wow.
and powers the whole game purely through that, meaning that it is an emission net zero game, which is a very, very uncommon thing.
That's really neat. I mean, that is a whole aspect of this we haven't gotten into and probably don't have time for today, but the climate carbon footprint, if you want to say, of creating games is obviously something to consider. And I know a lot of companies and developers are wrestling with that impact as well. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Jacob Geller is a video essayist and author of How a Game Lives.
And thank you so much for having me on. It was a pleasure.